For this debate, I watched it a couple times, and I would just have to say that I think the side against the motion won. The motion was that celebrity culture is harming young people. I'm not judging this, by any means, by any personal opinions I may have about celebrities or social media. I'm just looking at who made less fallacies within their arguments, and who had the stronger argument overall. So let's get into it. So I think that the side supporting the motion brought up some good points, and I think that they did a good job explaining why some people are concerned about celebrity culture. They talked a lot about things like social media influencers, social media is just a platform, unrealistic expectations, and how young people can be influenced by what they see online. These are definitely real life concerns, and it definitely relates to social media because of how big of a part it is or key factor it is to a lot of younger people's everyday life and how they use it. Do think, however, that this side relied too much on personal experiences and emotional examples rather than like evidence based arguments. I feel like they just pulled too many personal, like, oh, I feel like it's bad because this happened to me type of deal. Um, Tony Little talked a lot about what he's seen as a teacher. And while those experiences are completely valid and I understand them a lot, they don't necessarily prove that celebrity culture is harming all young people. Just because something happens in one classroom, in one area doesn't mean it happens in every classroom in every area. So it's one of those things where it's just a little bit of a slippery slope. This is where I think the argument actually becomes a little weaker because he just limited it to his individual experience rather than relying on broader evidence. I also think Ashish Advani did the same thing. He had a very slippery slope argument. He suggested that social media and influencer culture can lead to young people or can lead young people toward harmful outcomes. I understand. I understand the point that was trying to be made. Well, that can happen in some situations. I don't think it's fully proved that those outcomes are guaranteed, or even likely for most young people. There are millions of young people who use social media every day for hours on end, and I think they all have different outcomes with it. Some have very positive experiences with social media. Some have very negative experiences. Just because some are good and some are bad doesn't mean that the majority are good or the majority are bad. It's a good mix of experiences. I also think another thing that I noticed is that some arguments seem to oversimplify the situation. There was a proposition brought it up. They related it to a buffet where it's like you could have one without the other, and related that to young people choosing the healthy options versus unhealthy options, which is it's a fair point. I understand what you're trying to say, but it's not a buffet. You don't have to choose dessert over a healthier option. In this case, it's like you could have the dessert with the healthier option at the same time. Some people use social media for educational purposes, some use it for entertainment, some people use it for both. You can have one, the fun option, and then the educational option at the same time. So you don't have to pick and choose. You have the power to use both. And I think the side that argues against the motion also has some weaknesses as well to it. They spend a lot of time highlighting positive examples of celebrity culture and influences who have made a positive impact. Because of this, it sometimes felt like they were focusing only on the good and on the success stories, while not fully addressing that, there's harmful examples brought up by the other side. Like that's a fair point. You can't just highlight everything good without acknowledging the bad. That's unfair. That's not a good point to prove, in my opinion. Even so, I thought the opposition did a better job presenting a balanced view of the issue because at least they said, there's two sides of it. They weren't just highlighting on either the good or highlighting on either the bad. Instead of arguing that celebrity culture is completely positive, they argue that it depends on how people interact with it. They acknowledge that there are negative examples, but they also show that celebrity culture does have the ability to inspire people and highlight opportunities and help spread important messages. That made their argument seem more realistic to me just because they were able to have a balance to it. And one thing that really stood out to me was that the opposition seemed more willing to recognize how complicated the issue actually is. And the proposition often made celebrity culture sound like the main cause of certain problems facing young people. The opposition argued that there are many factors that influence young people, including family, education, friends, and just society and culture as a whole. I think that this is a stronger argument because it recognizes that problems usually have multiple causes rather than just one simple explanation. They were bringing in a lot of external factors and not throwing it, but like presenting that as one piece, not just social media and celebrity culture is this because of this. they said it's this because of this, this, and this, which I think is a great way of doing it. But when I look specifically at argument fallacies, I think the proposition committed the majority of the important ones. Their use of anecdotal evidence and slippery slope reasoning weakened some of the points that they were really trying to make. The opposition wasn't perfect, but their arguments generally relied less on those fallacies and focused more on explaining why the issue is more complicated than it actually appears. Because of that, I would have to say that the opposition. I would have to say that the opposition to the side against the motion won the argument. I think they presented the more balanced argument. They avoided some of their bigger logical mistakes, and they did a better job showing that celebrity culture is not automatically harmful to young people. Even if someone personally agrees with parts of the proposition, I think that the opposition as a whole just made the stronger case and was ultimately more persuasive in this entire debate. So, thanks.